In this lecture, we will talk about Windows Forms, and we'll talk about how we can design an interface for a desktop application using those specific libraries. So, we will use Windows Forms, which is one of the oldest kind of project available in .NET framework, and this is the kind of project which is used for desktop applications. Now, this is not the only way of creating desktop application in .NET platform. There are newer ones like WPF, Universal Windows App, and so on. We will stick to it because it is the most simple way of creating any kind of interface in .NET framework. Okay, I will start with the new project. I will choose Windows Classic Desktop, Windows Forms App, .NET Framework. For now, I will just call it Dean's Office. App, and the solution will be called just the Dean's Office. And I will just click OK. Okay, after creating new project, we see that I have, well, the structure in the Solution Explorer is pretty similar to what we had in Console app. However, we have one additional element called Form 1. On this element, Form 1, I can actually add different controls. I will go to the toolbox, and as we see, I have a bunch of different controls I can use. Now, how actually it works? Well, Form1 CS is just a C# class. Whenever I will just close this design view, double click it, we see whenever we double click it, we open a design view in which we can actually kind of visually see the preview of this window. We can actually add controls to this window from the toolbox, and remember that this toolbox is only contains element only when we will, as we see, when we will enter the design mode. From this toolbox, I can just drag and drop in different controls, and of course each control is just a C# class. Whatever we are doing in this design view, we could do directly from code, probably in a way that you did it when you were doing some Java programming. So for example, I can just drag and drop, let's say from the all Windows Forms, a button control, and we see that I got this button in here. Moreover, I can just click it once, I will make it a little bit bigger, and I can go to the properties window, and I can set a bunch of properties of this control. So for example, I can change the text from button 1 to anything else I want. Do something. Okay, so what is happening, and actually where the code is located. I'm just adding different things. We see that something is happening behind the scenes, but we don't really see what is going on. When I'm on this design view, I can choose right click of the mouse and choose the view code or F7 button. When I will choose it, I will enter the something which is called a code behind. Code behind is just a C# class in which we can program directly everything we want during the raw C# programming language. Actually, I can do in here whatever I want. Actually, I could program all of those things I've done in here directly in code without using this design view. However, this design view is just much faster when it comes to adding controls, setting the different layout options, and so on. So, what I can do in this window. In here, I can just program various things. For example, I can select my button 1, and we see that the only thing I have is just a single constructor calling the initialize component method, and we see that I have here an attribute, a variable called button1, and I will change the back color to color dot, let's say, aqua. Now I will try to run the application. Application is being compiled, and now I have a window, and we see I have my button. We see that the color of this button is actually changed to aqua color. I can change the size of the window, and I can change different other options like resizing, closing it, and folding it to the start menu, and so on. I will just close it for now. Well, all of those basics options of the window, like maximizing, minimizing, is available from the form class. This is the base class of our form, which means window, and this two dots means extending and or implementing. So in C# language, extending from the other class or implementing an interface is done using the same syntax, which means those double dots. Okay, so what else? What is happening here is actually where this button comes from. Where are this control added? We see one thing, that if I did something through code, like setting the aqua button, the color or back color to the aqua, this is not visible in here, because we're doing this on the runtime level, not on the design one, so this is not visible in here. Okay, so the thing is that this class is declared as partial class. In C# language, we can split the definition of the class into multiple files if they are located in the same namespace and they have this partial class keyword available in them. For example, I can just open the form1 and we see we have a file called form1 designer.cs. If I will just enter it, we will see that in this form1 designer.cs class, we have just another partial class with the same name form1. In here we have a bunch of controls, and we have, as we see, just a private field button1. I can change it to maybe OK button to make the name more clear, and now I can get back to here and we see that this doesn't really work anymore, but if I change it to OK button, it works. Yeah, so this is exactly the button which we are using, which we've added when we are dragging and dropping things on my form1 designer. Now the problem is that I shouldn't modify this form1 designer code manually. So I shouldn't just change it to button OK button. I will get back to it. I will go to my button control, go to properties and set one property which you should always set for all the controls, which is at the very top, the name property, and in here I will change it to OK button. Now the code should work, or maybe do something button. Okay, I will get back to my form1 designer in a second. Okay, and now you will see that I can use now do something button. Now we have a little problem in here. I think we didn't save we didn't save the changing of this property. I have to change it again. Let's change it to do something button. Yeah, I think it changed now, and now it works. Okay, I will open the designer code again. We see that now it's called do something, but the most important thing is that I will open this Windows Form Designer generated code, and in here we have this initialize component method which we are calling from our code behind constructor. And we see that in here I have do something button, and all the things I've done in my design view are actually visible in here. So I changed the text of my button, I set the tab index, the size, all the things are kind of implemented in here directly in the C# code. Yeah, so this is the place which is actually changing. So I would just go to my button and maybe change the location of it, and we see that both of those two files have some changes in it, and actually the location of this button changed. So this code is regenerated each time we are doing something in our design view. In most of the cases we shouldn't touch this code and we shouldn't change it, because each time we do something in the design view, this code will be regenerated and all our changes will be overridden. Okay, So what is happening is that during the compilation process, this file, this part of the class form1 and this part are actually merged together into a single class. But what is nice is that during the development process, those two files are splitted, and this is good because in one file, the one which is called code behind, sits our code, which we've written ourselves, and in the designer, it's just the code generated by .NET Framework, by Visual Studio. Okay, so what else we can do? I will add some more controls. I will go to the toolbox and maybe add checkbox control. As we see, the names are pretty descriptive, so you shouldn't have a problem figuring out what the control does. Maybe I will add from the data section data grid view, which is a control for displaying rows and columns, probably the most popular one in this kind of application. Okay, when I will run my, not this button, sorry, when I will choose without debugging, we see that our controls are added. All of the controls in here have pretty basic, pretty similar elements, because all those classes from here are actually extending the special subclass called control. So one thing which is, we won't be going through all of the controls and all the properties, but always change the name property of the control, because this is the name using from our programming language, so it should be descriptive. Usually the name of the describing the control, and then the type of the control, like OK button or students data grid view. This kind of thing should be pretty descriptive. Okay, what else? From all of those controls in here, I would like to point out a special type of the controls which are called containers. So when I will run this code, we see that when I'm changing the size of my window, it doesn't really look nice. The controls doesn't really are not really responsive. Well, to fix it, I'll just make this a little bit larger. I will use the containers section of the toolbox, and here are the controls which are used just for laying out other controls. I will drag and drop control which is called panel, and I will use one property which is very useful, and all the controls have it, which is called dock. I will change the dock property to top, and we see that now this panel is actually kind of extending to the full width of the window, but we can actually change the size, the height. So if I will run this code, this panel will always have 100% width, even if I'll change the width dynamically, but the height is set by me. I will just take those controls and just drag them over the panel so that they will be inside the panel. Now panel is over them. So I will just do it like this. And let's say that I would like this control to always fill all the available space. To do it, I can change this control's dock property to this middle button called fill. And now we see that this grid view will fill all the available space. I will just run this code, and we see that now this controls is always filling all the available space. So the code is more kind of nice, more convenient for us. Now, what else? The problem is that this grid view control is actually 100% height, because it goes to the top. We don't see it, but it goes over the panel to the top. This is not how I want to do it, because I would like this grid view control to end in here. Well, if we have something like this, problem with those overriding or overlapping controls, I will go to the document outline window available only in the design view, and I will drag the grid view in here. Oh, and now we see, now grid view ends in here. So this is exactly what I want. Otherwise, the names of the columns would be kind of overlapped, and we wouldn't see them when we will add some data to this. Now I will go back to my code. Now, of course, what we will most likely to do is to program different events. In the C# language, in the Windows Forms application, we are using what is called an event-driven programming model, which means that each control allows us to register for different types of events. So I will click once the button, I will go to the properties window, and in here we have this lightning bolt which is called events. If I will click it, I will have a bunch of names which actually are describing different types of events. Of course, we see we see that button has a click event, but also we have a number of other events: key press, key up, key down. All of them allow us to register for this type of event and do something in case this will happen. So I will just, to register to an event, I will just click this empty space next to the click label. Double click it, which means that in our code we added automatically new method, private method called doSomethingButton underscore name of the event, which is click in this case. And let's say that inside of this method I will add some code, which will be messagebox.show, and I will just type some code. Now I will execute this code, click it, and we see that when I click this button, actually a new Windows pops out with some text. And this is what this messagebox show is doing. So we see that we really created a method which is usually called an event handler, because this method handles the event. And when I click the button, method is executed. Now, two things. All the event handlers look pretty much the same, which means they have pretty much two similar attributes in here, parameters. One is called the sender, and this is the object which called the event, which in our case is probably set to the button or to the OK button. Now, the next one is event args, which just contains various data about these events. It can be the location of the cursor, it can be some other things depending on the event. Now, but why this method is actually called? There's nothing in here to connect this method to this event really. Now, of course, the rest of it sits in our code behind. So I will go to the Form1 Designer CS, go to the Windows Form Designer generated code. We see that all the other controls are already added in here. And in here we see that when I have my do something button in here, and here is a line of code which binds an event handler to this specific event. So I have do something.click plus equal. I'm creating the new instance of event handler, and as a parameter I'm just typing the name of my method. So this line of code is actually means we are registering for this event. We are using here delegates and some other elements which we'll discuss later. Now I will just close it, get back to here. Now we don't have to do it like this. I can do it completely manually. For example, I can create another method which will be called do something button OK. I click to do something like this, and then here I will type OK button. Oh, sorry, do something button. Click. Oh. Again, do something button dot click plus equal, and I can actually use the shorter syntax, which is just the name of my method, and that's it. And now when I will run my code, I will click the button. We have the first event handler called out, and now the second. So actually I can register as many methods as I want to the specific event. They will be called basically in random order. We cannot be sure in what order those methods will be called, and this is what Microsoft tells us. So we cannot kind of depend on this order. Now, let's say that in this method, do something click, when this method is called, I will also do something like this. Do something dot click minus equal and the name of this method. So what is happening is now I'm unregistering for the event. So the first time I will call it, I will click this button. Both of them will be called. So this first one, the second one. Now when I will call it again, only the first one is called, and then that's it. Because I'll unregister during the first execution of this method from this event. So we see we can dynamically register and unregister from those events. This is our event-driven programming model, which is pretty convenient and pretty easy to use. Now, one thing which may kind of cause you some headaches is that if you would like to remove an event handler, so I would like to remove this one. So I will just delete it. Now I will go to the design view and we will get this error message. There are some error messages. We can't really render the preview window and so on and so on. What is happening? What we can do? Well, actually you have to go to the Form1 Designer, or you can actually click Build. And remember that you always have this error list window in which there is description of the error. I can just double click it, and it turns out that in our Form1 Designer CS we just removed the method which was bound to this event. So of course I have to also, and this time manually, remove this line of code. I will get back now to the designer, and now everything is back together, is working correctly. So this is how you can work with those controls. Now remember that this we cannot just add any method to an event. The signature of the method must be like this. So if I will just add some method like this, then it's okay. But then if I will just add some another method like this, but without, let's say, this or this, and I will just call it like this. Now I will go to my design view to make it kind of more visible. And I will use this drop-down list next to the click event, and we see that in here I have only two methods, click 3 and click 2. I can click one of them, but we see that the third one, this method, is not visible because the signature of it doesn't correspond to this specific delegate type. Okay, so this is how it works. So we can register to different events. Of course, there is some more behind it when it comes to the C# language and how it works, but this should be enough for us. Remember that each control has some pretty similar elements. Always change the name property and the doc property to make sure that the control resizes itself according to the window, so we have responsive design. And now I would like to work with some data. I will just create a new method, private void load data. Now I will just make it in here, called the load data. Now I will create a list of student. Of course, I don't have a student class, so I will go to the Solution Explorer in here, right click in here, click Add Class, and in here I will just add student. Okay, public class student with a few fields like ID student, first name and last name. I'm using the shortcut PROP plus tab to write this property faster. Now I will close it, get back in here, it already works, and in here I will immediately create a few. So I'm just creating a kind of static data source in which all the data kind of comes just from my code. Yeah. Maybe I will create two more students. Okay, just so we have some data. Now, each control which is used for displaying data, like a grid view control, a list box, a combo box, usually has a property called, I will just use the name string data grid view, data source, which means the source of data. So I will just set it to my list. Now I will just run my code, and we see that immediately after running this method, the grid view control was smart enough to use my list to generate the columns, rows, to even allow me to select whole row or specific cells, and I can even change the data in a specific cell by double click. So we have a lot of functionality built in. We just provided a data source. Actually, I think we can use anything as data source, which is the implementation of IEnumerable, which we talked about before, which is this interface used by all the collection in C# language. This is why the knowledge of them is pretty useful. Of course, usually the data will come from the database, so we will have to somehow hook it up to relational database, and we will do it soon. Okay, Now, let's say that I would like to work with my control. I say I would like to create I would like my button. I would like, for example, to display some message always when the user is changing the selection in this grid view. And how to do it? So I have some requirements. I don't know this class really. So I will just go to the properties window and check different events, and I will try to look for the one which seems that I want to use. We see that the grid view control has a lot of different events. Most likely this should be called something like selected something. So maybe selection changed or something like this. There is one called selection change, and we have description at the bottom. I think we have to kind of force it up. Okay, occurs when the current selection changes. So it seems that this is what we want. I will just make this now smaller. Okay, so I will double click selection change. Now I'm not sure if this is the event I want, so I will just create some lines of code in here, put the breakpoint, and run the code in the debugging mode. Okay, I'm waiting, and we see that immediately I enter this code. This is because I think the selection change is even issued, this event, when we are setting the data source. So next, okay, and now let's say I will select the whole row, the third row. I click it, and we see that immediately we stopped on this breakpoint, which means that this event handler was called. I will hover over sender, and we see that sender is our data grid view control, just as we said. I will hover over event args and check what is inside of it. Oh, sorry. We see we have to do a lot of clicking to get to inside of this method. Well, as we see, there is nothing interesting in this event args for us for now. And let's say that now I would like to display to display all the selected rows from this control, all the selected rows by which user select. Now, how I can do it? I don't know. I haven't worked with this class before. So I will use this debugging mode and the fact that I stopped on this breakpoint to kind of try to find the property which suits my requirements. Okay, and this is the way we can work with events. Now, I would like to find the property which allow me to get all the selected rows. I will go in the debugging mode while I stopped at the breakpoint to the immediate window and type students grid view, and I will try to look for the property I want to use, selected rows. I can click it. I have count 1, so there is one selected row. I will select the first one. As we see, inside of it we have some other objects, and I can try to just kind of look for, as we see, we need to do so long lines of code to get to the selected row. But actually I can use this debugging mode to kind of quickly see if the property I found is what I want or not. So probably this is the way to work with the classes that you don't know yet. It's much faster than just changing the code, compiling, running, and looking for the code you want like this. Okay, now I will do small change. I will create another method which I will call private void load data from SQL server. Now I will just call this method from here instead of the other one. I just commented out the previous one. Now I would like to get the data from the server. Now to do it, I will go to my local SQL server. I will just create some database. Let's say Dean's Office 3. Oh, sorry. Dean's Office, I think even 4 now. I will create new query. I'll just create one table with a few rows in it, so that we have something to work with. Create table students, ID student, int primary key identity. Now we have first name varchar 50 not null, and last name varchar 50 not now. Okay, that's it. I will execute this. Okay, and now I will add some data. Well, I will just use the edit window. So go to my table, students, edit top 200 rows, and I will add some records like this, so it will be a little bit quicker. Okay, as usual, Jan Kowalski. Of course, I don't have to fill the ID student because it is generated by the database. Okay, I'll just close it. I get my data. I will get back to my method. Now, to get now we will use the most kind of lower level way of connecting to database. To do it, I will use two classes. One of them is called SqlConnection, which comes from the System Data SQL Client library, which, as we see, I just imported. And this class represents connection to database. Now, the other class, which is SqlCommand, represents SQL which we want to send to the database. Usually, in all the other languages, if you want to use this kind of low level of connecting to database, all of those steps will be pretty much similar. Now, I have to set my command.connection to my connection object, because the command will use this connection to send database, and command.command text to some SQL. Select star from students. We already see that working with relational database is always a problem, because the relational world and object world, the world of objective-oriented language, is pretty much different. So it means that when I run my code, for example, in this case, I will only get an error message if I will run the code. So for example, if I will make a mistake in here or in here, I will get the error only during the runtime, which is pretty bad when it comes to object-oriented programming. So yeah, now before I will run this command, I'll have to open the connection to the database. Now I will run execute reader command, which executes my SQL statement and send it to database, which will return me object called SQL data reader. And now I can use this data reader to read some data from the result set, which means reading record by record from my result. I will just now create a student list like this. I will create a new student each time we are reading a new record, and ID student as it is, change it to int, then new as the first name, change it to first name, and last name, last name. Okay, and then at the very end I will add this new student, add to my collection. And then at the very end, what I will do is to simply students grid view data source assign the students collection to my results. So this how this whole method looks like. I'm creating the connection, creating the SqlCommand object which represents the command I want to send to database. I'm opening the connection. Now I can send for this connection this command, get the SQL data reader back, read it record by record, and then assign the result to my students data grid view. I'll run this code and check if it works. The code is compiled and nothing. I get nothing. If something like this happens, I will run the code in the debugging mode and probably we have an error. And the error message is that connection string is not initialized. And this is okay because what I actually didn't specify one important thing. I didn't specify what connection string is for this object, so we don't know to which database we want to connect. Now to generate this connection string, I will go to View Server Explorer. I have to find it somewhere in here. Server Explorer. I will add new connection to my list of connections. As the server, I will, in my case, I will use my local database. In your case, you can use DBMS SQL or something else. And I will select as my database DINS Office 4. Test connection succeeded. Okay. Now new connection is added. And now when I will go to the properties window, I have connection string in here available for me. I can just copy it and go in here, and just paste it. So this is how the connection string looks like. Data source, and here we can use the URL, the IP, means, well, the data source where this database is located. Initial catalog, the database to which I want to connect. Integrated security, how we are solving the issue of authentication and so on. Integrated security means using the Active Directory. Now I'll run this whole thing again, and we see that now the code works, and I downloaded the students from my database, and now I actually displaying the students from database. Now step by step, what is happening? Now we are using very low level way of connecting to database. This is also probably the fastest way to get the data from the database. However, the disadvantage of this kind of way of working with database is that we have to do a lot of things. Here we have to do all the parsing by ourselves, which may not be easy because usually the object can, in the relational database, single object in C# language can consist in relational database from a number of tables. So it isn't really always one table to one object mapping. Yeah, usually it can be much more complex. Of course, maybe from one select statement we would like to create a set of separate objects. So it even became much harder than this. Now, what else? Well, secondly, we have to be very careful about using those classes. For example, those two classes allow me to connect only to SQL Server. If I want, I could choose to use a different collection, which is called class, which is called OleDB connection. I will use it now, and OleDB command. Actually, the rest of the code shouldn't really change much. However, the problem is that those classes are using the OleDB standard, which means that they can work with various types of database, not only SQL Server. The disadvantage of using them is that probably they are a little bit less performant than SqlConnection, because if we have SqlConnection and SqlCommand, those classes target only SQL Server, so that programmers can use some different tricks or hacks how to make it faster when it comes to working with SQL Server. In this case, we cannot do this because we don't know what kind of database we will be working with. Secondly, using those classes, we cannot really use some database-specific features, like we'd like some very specific feature of SQL Server. We probably will have problem using it because those two classes have to use only the basic level of features provided by SQL, by databases, because all of the databases have to provide it. They are using the kind of common ground when it comes to programming against database. I'll get back to SqlConnection and SqlCommand. Now, the only problem is that even if we use OleDB connection and OleDB command, still we know that SQL language is usually database specific. So even if I can easily switch from different database, it means that still I have problems because this SQL language is a dialect, so it probably will be a little bit different on other database, in other language. Yeah, so this is Transact SQL. If I switch it to Oracle, I would have to use PL SQL, which means I probably have to rewrite some of those statements. Now, one of the most important thing is that database connection is always a very important resource, and we should always release it after we are done with it. And this is extremely important by using, let's say, dispose method. Now, this is important because relational databases work in a very specific manner using the feature which is called connection pool. If I have my relational database, so this is my DB, when the new request comes in with some SQL language to be executed, database usually will create a new thread to handle this connection. And the problem is that opening and creating new thread is an intensive operation for the computer. It requires allocating resources and so on and so on. So what all of the relational database are basically doing is they when we start the database, already database will keep around 100 or 220 open connection at the same time. This is called connection pool. So all the things like initialization, allocating memory is already done. All of those connections are just sitting there waiting for something to use them. So when the new connection will comes in, the database will simply pick one of those connections and just assign it to handle this request. And this is what is happening when I calling connection open. Then when I call connection dispose, this connection is returned to the connection pool. And we have to know that there are not too many of those connections, 100 on 120. So it is not a lot. And all the other databases are using pretty much similar connection pool, similar number of open connections. So it means that if we don't return it back to the connection pool, it means that the other user can have lower and lower number of open connection because they are used, and then at some point other users will have problems connecting to database. It doesn't mean that when you want to return the connection, it will never be returned. This is because database have some kind of timeout, so still after like 30 seconds it will be returned, but still it would make working with this database much harder for the other users. So we have to do it always. In C# language, this is pretty simple, pretty easy. You can just think about it like this. Whenever any kind of class has a dispose method, it means basically that we should call this dispose method as soon as we can, because this is probably mean that this class deals with some kind of limited resources. And our SqlConnection has this dispose method available. I could use it do it like this, but the problem is that, of course, if I will encounter some kind of error in here, this connection would never be released. So you of course know that we could use try catch finally clause to do it, and put this disposing of the connection in the finally clause, and we could do it like this, or we could use something which is called a using statement. As we see, I just will wrap the whole SqlConnection in this using statement, and then use this curly braces to wrap the other things in it. So in this case, it means that I can use in the using block whatever has a dispose method. Any class that has a dispose method can be used in the using block. And then when this whole code finishes, so when the code reaches this line, this variable will be disposed of. And we don't have to worry about any kind of error, because even if there will be some kind of error in here, still using will always dispose of. So it works kind of like finally clause. Now, one thing to remember is that when you are designing your own class, so we should always close the connection, yes, because we can very easily kind of deplete the number of connection pool. When you are working with your own class, and let's say that one of your classes is using some kind of important resources, then the pattern is that you should by yourself implement the iDisposable interface, which means that you should provide a method which is called dispose. This is called a dispose pattern, yeah. And I have to, in here I should do something to release the resources. And now I can actually use whatever is implementing this interface can be used in the using block. So I could get back to my code, and then some other programmers could use your own class in the using block. So I could type something like, and we see that it works. It works because my student is implementing the dispose pattern. Okay, one more thing. If you are connecting to database and would like to send some parameters, so I would just type where last name is equal to plus, and let's say that last name is some kind of string variable, Kowalski in here, plus L plus 1 apostrophe like this. Well, you can do it like this. And most likely when you have to pass some parameters to the database, it will work. We see that it worked. I got just one student, Kowalski. Now, the problem with this kind of approach is that you should never do this in any kind of language like this. This means that this L, this value of last name, probably will come from some kind of input from the user. And if you are doing this like this, user could just type anything in here, and try to, as you see, and can try to exit by concatenating something like this in here, can try to exit this select statement and do something bad to your database. So in this case, I can basically inject SQL into my database. So the user can use this this basically wrong way of implementing the parameter to inject any kind of SQL to your database, to even drop table, and so on and so on. This is because this is just a string value which is sent to the database. Now, to handle this kind of problem, you should always, and this is available in any kind of language, again, this is not a C# thing, you should always do this using the parameters. In this case, the parameter would look like this. So I just created some kind of placeholder using this sign and any kind of name we want, last name, let's say. And then the object command has something as parameters, which I can use like this. Like this. And now this whole statement is pre-compiled, and then only a placeholder is left for the value to be placed in here. So it means that even if this user would type anything he wants, like drop table, anything else, it would be still treated as the literal value, because this whole thing is pre-compiled. So this way you can kind of save yourself from the SQL injection attacks, which are pretty popular still and always probably will be, and make your application more secure. You should always use parameters. So this is important. If you are using insert, update, delete, always use parameters the same way as we did in here. So remember about it. If I will just call it right now, I still get a single user, but now actually this whole thing is saved. This whole thing is safe when it comes to security of my application and so on. So remember how to use it. Also remember to always open the connection before using it, because you will get an error. Always setting the proper connection string, always using the parameters, always make sure that you are disposing your connection, or just means closing your connection, in a safe way. So that's it. I hope that it was more or less clear and you remember this. And this is, again, those rules are not something C# specific or SqlCommand specific. This is something typical to any kind of language and to any kind of class which allow you to connect to database. Now, one more thing which I didn't mention. Now, I'm reading the data about student like this. I didn't told you too much about this data reader object, which is SQL data reader. If I will hover over var, we see that this is SQL data reader. I'm just using those var keywords because they are just quicker to write. I could just type it like this. Now, what is the difference? What is that different? Now, this SQL data reader is not a collection. So I cannot just ask later on and let's say, give me the 6th student, or give me the count property, how many students I have, or how many rows, same thing. This is because when you are working with relational database, you are always using forward only collection. It means that this data reader allow me to read records, data record by record. So we can think about it like just reading the data one record at a time, one row at a time. And this is because we don't know if this SQL statement will give us back 2 million records, 100,000 records, or maybe 10 records. So we cannot just read in the whole data which comes back from the database into RAM memory, because we won't be sure if this will actually fit our memory. So always those kind of classes are reading data sequentially. So it kind of means that we are working with streams of data. It means that only reading the data chunk by chunk, and the read method simply is checking if there is another record to read in. If this is true, then go to this step. And read is kind of pointing our cursor to the next record. If there is a next record, this whole thing will return true, a Boolean value. Otherwise, it will return false. We will know that we reached the end of the SQL data reader. But we cannot just say, give me the student with the 10th student or the 5th student, because we are reading data one at a time. And this way, we can always work with 1 million records, 100,000 records, and so on and so on. We will never have a problem with not enough memory or something like this. So those collections are the forward-only collection, reading data sequentially, chunk by chunk. Well, never reading the whole data to the memory, unless this is just a very small set of records, probably just like in this case. But remember that this is how it works, and this is how it works in other languages also, because this allows us to deal with any kind of data when it comes to the size of this data. Okay, so that's it. I hope this was more or less clear. I hope that it kind of cleared a lot of the things about connecting to database, and it will be much more easier for you now.